Hi movie review lovers friends. Today I am going to describe the movie story of Rambo First Blood. Now let's talk about it. As we know that Rambo First Blood is a 1982 American war action film starring Sylvester Stallone as Vietnam War veteran John Rambo. The film was directed by Ted Kotcheff and co-written by Michael Kozel, William Sackheim, and Stallone based on the 1972 novel First Blood by David Morrell. The story follows Rambo who, after entering a small town and clashing with the police, attempts to survive a manhunt using his expertise in survival and combat skills. The film co-stars Richard Crenna as Rambo's mentor Colonel Sam Troutman and Brian Dennehy as Sheriff Will Teasel. First Blood was released in the United States on October 22, 1982. Initial reviews were mixed, but the film was a box office success, grossing $125.2 million and becoming the 13th highest grossing film at the domestic box office for the year and the 7th highest grossing film worldwide. In 1985, it also became the first Hollywood blockbuster to be released in China, holding the record for the largest number of tickets sold for an American film until 2018. Since its release, it has been reappraised by critics, with many highlighting the roles of Stallone, Dennehy, and Crenna and recognizing it as an influential film in the action genre. The film's success spawned the Rambo franchise, consisting of 4 sequels, co-written by and starring Stallone, an animated television series, a comic book series, a novel series, and several video games. It was followed by Rambo, First Blood Part 2, released in 1985. Plot. In December 1981, United States Army Vietnam War veteran John Rambo discovers that he is the last surviving member of his outfit after learning that his old Army buddy Delmar Berry has died from complications related to Agent Orange exposure from when they were deployed. Without direction, Rambo arrives in the town of Hope, Washington on foot, where he is accosted by local Sheriff Will Teasel, who judges him harshly and presumes him to be a drifter. Teasel escorts Rambo out of town and warns him not to return. Feeling slighted, Rambo begins to return to town, where Teasel quickly arrests him and leaves him to be processed under the supervision of Teasel's cruel Chief Deputy Art Galt, who leads other deputies in abusing Rambo. The abuse triggers flashbacks to torture that Rambo endured in Vietnam, and he fights his way out of town with his field knife into the surrounding mountains. Teasel organizes a search party with his fellow deputies, air support, and dogs. Galt ignores Teasel's orders and attempts to shoot Rambo from a low-flying helicopter, but falls to his death when Rambo throws a rock that causes the pilot to lose control. Teasel soon learns that Rambo is a former Special Forces soldier and recipient of the Medal of Honor, but refuses to cancel the search. Not wanting to cause more trouble, Rambo attempts to surrender, but is fired upon by the deputies and flees into the tree line. Rambo uses bushcraft to create traps to subdue the pursuing officers, threatening Teasel at knife point to abandon his pursuit before fleeing further into the woods. Washington State Patrol officers and Washington National Guard forces are dispatched to assist with the search, along with Rambo's mentor and former commanding officer Colonel Samuel Troutman. Troutman advises Teasel to relent, but Teasel refuses. Over radio, Rambo refuses Troutman's pleas to surrender, condemning Teasel and his men and insisting that they drew first blood. Rambo falls back to an abandoned mine, where National Guard units fire an M72 law to collapse the mine after suppressive fire fails to force Rambo to surrender. Teasel and the others initially presume Rambo to be dead, but Rambo escapes the mine through a ventilation shaft and returns to town after hijacking a military transport truck, intent on confronting Teasel. Troutman again fails to convince Teasel to cancel the pursuit, while Rambo creates a distraction by causing a gas station explosion, cutting power to most of the town and destroying a gun store. After shooting indiscriminately in the sheriff's office, Rambo shoots Teasel in the leg, grievously injuring him with an M60 machine gun that Rambo had taken from the military truck. Troutman arrives and appeals to Rambo, who finally relents and surrenders after relating his negative experiences from the war and from his return home. Troutman comforts Rambo before escorting him into federal custody. Teasel is taken to an ambulance for treatment of his injuries. Cast. Main article, List of Rambo characters. Sylvester Stallone as John J. Rambo. Richard Crenna as Colonel Samuel R. Sam Trotman. Brian Dennehy as Sheriff William Will Teasel. Bill McKinney as Captain Dave Kern. Jack Starrett as Deputy Sergeant Arthur Art Galt. Michael Talbot as Deputy Balford. Chris Mulkey as Deputy Ward. John McLeam as Orville Cullerman. Alf Humphreys as Deputy Lester. David Caruso as Deputy Mitch Rogers. David Crowley as Deputy Shingleton. Don McKay as Deputy Preston. Patrick Stack as Lieutenant Clinton Morgan. Production. Development. The original Rambo was so bloodthirsty, the story was so hard, so terrifying every step of the way. I think that's one reason the book took so long to get done. What I did with Rambo was try to keep one foot in the establishment and one foot in the outlaw or frontier image. I wanted him to be accepted by the mainstream, but also be a criminal. So he has some strong patriotic views, and he loves the system. He just doesn't like a lot of the people who live and work in it. Sylvester Stallone, 1985-4. In 1972, Lawrence Terman at Columbia Pictures bought the film rights to First Blood by David Morrell for $175,000. Richard Brooks was slated to direct, and intended to have the film be an allegory on differing American perceptions of World War II and Vietnam War veterans, with Sheriff Will Teasel portrayed more sympathetically than in the novel. The film would have ended with Teasel ordering his men to drop their guns to try to reason with John Rambo, who would have then been fatally shot by an unknown assailant. Brooks planned to start shooting First Blood in New Mexico in December 1972. The film did not proceed because the Vietnam War was still underway and Brooks left the project. Citation needed. Afterward, John Calley purchased the rights at Warner Brothers Pictures for $125,000 with the thought of casting either Robert De Niro or Clint Eastwood as Rambo. A screenplay was written by Walter Newman with Martin Ritt intended to direct. The film would have criticized American military culture and portrayed Colonel Sam Trotman as the film's villain, ending with both Rambo and Teasel dying. Sidney Pollack and Martin Bregman also considered directing the film, with Bregman hiring David Rabe to write a script. After Bregman departed, Mike Nichols considered directing Rabe's script. William Sackheim and Michael Kozol wrote the screenplay that would be the basis of the final film in 1977, originally intending for John Badham to direct. Producer Carter DeHaven purchased Sackheim and Kozol's script from Warner Brothers for $375,000. DeHaven secured the Cinema Group as a financier and hired John Frankenheimer as director, with production to begin in Georgia. This was also the first version of the script in which Rambo survived the film. However, the project stalled again after the distributor Filmways was acquired by Orion Pictures. After Mario Kassar and Andrew G. Vajna of Anabasis Investments read the book, they became interested in doing an adaptation as the first production of their studio Carolco Pictures, funded by in-house sources. They purchased the film rights from Warner Brothers for $375,000 and Sackheim and Kozol's script for $125,000 in 1981. Ted Kotcheff, who had been involved in the project in 1976, returned after Kassar and Vajna offered to finance one of his projects. Kotcheff offered the role of John Rambo to Sylvester Stallone, and the actor accepted after reading the script through in a day. 10. Various scripts adapted from Morrell's book had been pitched to studios in the years since its publication, but only Stallone's involvement prompted its production. The time since the end of the Vietnam War and Stallone's star power after the success of the Rocky films enabled him to rewrite the script to make the character of John Rambo more sympathetic. Morrell's book has Rambo kill many of his pursuers, and Kozol and Sackheim's draft had him killing 16 people, but in the movie Rambo does not directly cause the death of any police or National Guardsmen. Stallone also decided to let Rambo survive the film, unlike in the book. A suicide scene was filmed, but was reviled by test audiences. So Kotcheff and Stallone opted to have Rambo turn himself in at Trotman's urging. 10. Other changes made by Stallone included the addition of Rambo's survival knife. Stallone did an estimated 7 revisions of the script. Kochev requested further work be done on the script, which was performed by Larry Gross and David Giler. 4. Casting. Brooks originally wanted to cast Bette Davis as a psychiatrist and either Burt Lancaster or Lee Marvin as Sheriff Teasle. When the project was purchased by Warner Brothers, Robert De Niro and Clint Eastwood were each considered for the role of Rambo. 11. Ritt intended to cast Paul Newman as Rambo. 5. Pollock considered Steve McQueen, but then rejected him because they considered him too old to play a Vietnam veteran from 1975. 5. 12. James Caan, Burt Reynolds, and Robert Redford were also considered. 13. Rabe developed his screenplay with Al Pacino in mind for the role, and had several conversations with the actor, who wanted to portray Rambo as a force of nature after seeing the film Jaws. However, Pacino decided not to be involved because he found the story too dark. After his request that Rambo be a lunatic was dismissed by the producers. 11, 14, 15. When Badham was considered as director, he wanted to cast John Travolta as Rambo, George C. Scott as Troutman, and either Gene Hackman or Charles Durning as Teasle. Frankenheimer considered Powers Booth, Michael Douglas, and Nick Nolte as Rambo before casting Brad Davis because of his role in Midnight Express. 4. Dustin Hoffman was offered the role of Rambo but turned it down. 16. For the role of Sheriff Teasle, Kasser and Vajna approached Academy Award winners Hackman and Robert Duvall, but both turned the part down. Marvin, another Oscar winner, turned down the part of Colonel Troutman. James Mason and Richard Yeckel were also considered. Kirk Douglas was eventually hired. Douglas wrote in his autobiography The Rodman's Son that he initially rejected the script but agreed after Kochev changed it to retain the novel's original ending. When the ending was changed back to Stallone's version, he left the project. 17. He wrote, "I thought it would be better, dramatically, if my character realized what a Frankenstein monster, amoral killer, and menace to society he has created and kills Stallone. If they'd listened to me, there would have been no Rambos. They would have lost $1 billion. 18. Rock Hudson was approached as a replacement but was soon to undergo heart surgery and had to pass up the chance to work with Stallone. Richard Crenna was hired as a replacement. The role of Troutman became the veteran character actor's most famous role, a performance for which he received much critical praise. 10. Filming. The Bridge in Hope, BC, used during production. The film was shot in the Fraser Valley of British Columbia on a $15 million budget, beginning on November 15, 1981, and continuing until April 1982. 10-8. The town scenes in the movie were shot in Hope and the nearby Coquihalla Canyon Provincial Park, called Chapman Gorge in the film. 19. While the rest of the movie was shot in Capilano Canyon, Golden Ears Provincial Park, and Pitt Lake in Pitt Meadows. During the production, Buzz Feitshans replaced producer Ed Carlin, who suffered a heart attack. 4-8. The locations chosen for the film initially experienced unseasonably warm and sunny weather during the filming, which posed challenges since the crew had counted on an overcast setting. However, a period of heavy snowfall beginning in January 1982 delayed the production by 2 months. Other delays were caused by injuries to the cast during stunts, including Stallone sustaining a serious back injury and several broken ribs, in particular, due to performing his own stunt of dropping off a cliff and into a tree. 20-21-8. Since the production ran over schedule, Crenna's role in the film was reduced in order to avoid having to pay him higher fees as specified in his contract. 17. The firearms used in the film had to be imported into Canada because of the country's firearms regulation. 22-23. In January 1982, over $50,000 worth of firearms, including 14 M16 rifles, 3 Remington shotguns, 2.44 Magnum revolvers, and 11 Colt AR-15 rifles, were stolen from the set. Although the guns had been modified to shoot blanks, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police claimed that they could be easily modified to fire live ammunition. After the incident, the set was guarded by the Canadian Army, whose soldiers also served as extras in the film. 17-8. Post-production. The first rough cut of the film was between 3 and 3.5 hours long. According to Stallone, it was so bad that it sickened him and his agent. Stallone wanted to buy the movie and destroy it, thinking that it was a career killer. After heavy re-editing, the film was cut down to 93 minutes. This version was ultimately released in theaters. 24. The ending used in the finished film was shot in March 1982, after the original one was deemed unsatisfactory. 25. Kasser and Bajna sought either Warner Brothers, 20th Century Fox, or Paramount Pictures as a distributor, displaying an 18-minute promotional reel to studios. Although they secured international distributors, they were unable to locate a domestic distributor to the film until they sent a longer 55-minute reel to the American film market. After Warner Brothers and Paramount expressed interest, Orion Pictures agreed to the domestic distribution of the film. 8. Music. Main article, First Blood soundtrack. The film's score was composed and conducted by Jerry Goldsmith, whose theme, It's a Long Road, added a new dimension to the character, and featured in the film's 3 sequels and animated spin-off Rambo, The Force of Freedom. The soundtrack was originally released on LP by the Regency label, although it was edited out of sequence for a more satisfying listen. The album was reissued on CD with one extra track, No Power, twice, first as one of Entrada Records' initial titles, then as an identical release by Varese Sarabande. The complete score was released by Entrada in a 2-CD set, along with a remastered version of the original album, with the Carolco logo previously released on La La Land Records' Extreme Prejudice album, and the Rambo First Blood Part 2 trailer music added, on November 23, 2010, as one of their MAF Unlimited titles. Release. Home media. David Morrell recorded an audio commentary track for the First Blood Special Edition DVD released in 2002. Sylvester Stallone recorded an audio commentary track for the First Blood Ultimate Edition DVD released in 2004. This edition also includes the original ending in which Rambo commits suicide, and a humorous ending tacked on afterwards. A brief snippet of the suicide ending appears in a flashback in the 4th movie Rambo. Lionsgate also released this version on Blu-ray. Both commentary tracks are on the Blu-ray release. Momentum Pictures released an HD DVD version of First Blood in the United Kingdom in April 2007. Lionsgate also released First Blood as a double feature on February 13, 2007, along with 2004's The Punisher. 26. First Blood was released on 4K UHD Blu-ray on November 9, 2018. 27. Reception. Box office. First Blood topped the U.S. box office for 3 weeks in a row, 28, and its $6,642,005 opening weekend was the best October opening at the time. 10. The film ended as a significant financial success, with a total gross of $64 million domestically, the highest-grossing film of the fall, 29, and the 13th highest-grossing film of the year, 30. The film grossed $160.3 million worldwide, against a $15 million budget. 6. It was the first major Hollywood blockbuster to be released in China, where it was released in 1985. 31. It sold 76 million tickets in China, the highest for a foreign Hollywood film up until 2018. Critical response. The film received mixed reviews from critics, and 3 lead actors received praise for their performances. In his review, Roger Ebert wrote that he did not like the film's ending, but added it was a very good movie, well-paced, and well-acted not only by Stallone, but also by Crenna and Brian Dennehy. He commented, although almost all of First Blood is implausible, because it's Stallone on the screen, we'll buy it, and rated the film 3 out of 4 stars. 32. The New York Times film critic Janet Maslin described Rambo as a fierce, agile, hollow-eyed hero, who is portrayed as a tormented, misunderstood, amazingly resourceful victim of the Vietnam War, rather than as a sadist or a villain. Maslin also praised the film's story for its energy and ingenuity. 33. Conversely, Variety called the film a mess and criticized its ending for not providing a proper resolution for the main character. 34. Film writer Jack Hawkins took a different view on the ending, praising the scene for containing the finest acting of Stallone's career, adding, "There are no one-liners, no showy acts of bravado, just messy emotion without any catharsis. Stallone couldn't have played the scene better, and neither could anyone else. 35. First Blood has been considered as belonging to the vetsploitation subgenre. 36, 37, 38, 39. In 2000, BBC film critic Almar Haflidason noted that Stallone's training in survival skills and hand-to-hand combat gave the film a raw and authentic edge that excited the audiences of the time. 40. Film.com and film site regard First Blood as one of the best films of 1982, 41-42. And in 2008 it was named the 253rd greatest film ever by Empire magazine on its 2008 list of the 500 greatest movies of all time. 43. In 2015, Rolling Stone ranked the movie at number 7 on a 10 best action movies of all time. 44. On review aggregator Rotten Tomatoes, the film has an 86% approval rating based on 49 reviews, with an average rating of July 20, 10. The site's critics' consensus reads, much darker and more sensitive than the sequels it spawned. First Blood is a thrilling survival adventure that takes full advantage of Sylvester Stallone's acting skills. 45. On Metacritic, the film has a weighted average score of 61 out of 100 based on 15 critics, indicating generally favorable reviews. 46. James Berardinelli of Real Views called the film a tense and effective piece of filmmaking. He noted that the film's darker tone, somber subtext, and non-exploitative violence allowed the viewer to enjoy the film not only as an action/thriller, but as something with a degree of intelligence and substance. On Stallone's performance, he wrote, "It seems impossible to imagine anyone other than Stallone in the part, and his capabilities as an actor should not be dismissed." 47. In the 2010 edition of his movie guide, Leonard Maltin gave the film 1.5 stars out of 4, saying that it throws all credibility to the winds about the time Rambo gets off with only a bad cut after jumping from a mountain into some jagged rocks. 48. Legacy. First Blood received the most positive reception of the Rambo franchise. The 4 sequels received mixed or average reviews. 49, 50, 51. In a 2011 article for Blade by Mike Carter, credit is given to Morrell and the Rambo franchise for revitalizing the cutlery industry in the 1980s due to the presence of the Jimmy Lyle and Gil Hibben knives used in the films. In 2003, Blade gave Morrell an Industry Achievement Award for having helped to make it possible. 52. Morrell said his being given the award is ironic because the knife was Sylvester Stallone's idea and does not appear in the novel. 5. Rambo's survival knife became an iconic movie weapon. In a July 28, 2013 auction, the original knife and its sheath were sold for $92,250, and even a set of 100 replicas of the knife produced by Lyle in 1982 have been valued at $45,000 each. 5. A writer from the American think tank Foundation for Economic Education commented that the sequence of events in the film are the result of police brutality. He goes on to say that Teasel's initial approach with Rambo was without reason, and that he could have driven him to the diner or simply left him alone. He assigned blame to Teasel's actions and compared the situation to a number of 21st century police encounters that turned deadly. 53. In the 2008 Season 4 episode of It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia, Mac and Dennis, manhunters, Mac, Rob McElhenney, and Dennis Reynolds, Glenn Howerton, are inspired by First Blood and decide to stage a manhunt against their former high school rival Rickety Cricket, David Hornsby. In the same episode, Frank Reynolds, Danny DeVito, also confuses his own life with that of First Blood and acts like he is having flashbacks to being in Vietnam. In 2017, It's a Long Road was used in the video game South Park, The Fractured But Whole. It appears when the player is killed and receives a game over. The Mountain Goats released the song First Blood on August 19, 2022 as part of the album Bleed Out, a reference to the movie. Varese Sarabande is an American record label owned by Concord Music Group and distributed by Universal Music Group, which specializes in film scores and original cast recordings. It aims to reissue rare or unavailable albums, as well as newer releases by artists no longer under a contract. The label's name was derived from combining French-born composer Edgar Varèse's last name with the musical term sarabande, a slow Spanish dance. As of February 2018, Varèse operates as a division of Concord Music Group's Craft Recordings label. 1. History. Varèse Sarabande's roots trace back to 1972, with the introduction of a predecessor imprint called Varèse International. The first LP release was Lumière by Dub Taylor. Varèse International Records was originally conceived as an avant-garde classical label. In the years that followed, under the management of the founder, owners, Dub Taylor and Chris Kuckler, the label expanded its catalog to include jazz, classical, and other genres of recordings. In 1977, Tom Knoll's Sarabande Records merged with Varèse International to form Varèse Sarabande Records. The early LP issues of the label were reissues of classical recordings from the American Decca, Remington, and JVC labels. The first film soundtrack LP album was released in 1978, though the advice of fledgling Hollywood writer, director/actor Bruce Kimmel, who was offered an ownership but politely turned it down at that time and would return to head the label's Broadway division in the early 1990s. The label's sudden success was mostly due to the soundtracks they released more so than their classical releases, and eventually the label leaned heavily towards soundtrack releases, many of which became bestsellers for the label that included John Carpenter's Halloween, Goblin's Dawn of the Dead, Fred Myro's Phantasm, 5 albums of the music from the classic TV series, The Twilight Zone, which were huge sellers, and their still popular reissue of the music from the late George A. Romero's classic horror film, Night of the Living Dead. They still produced classical releases under the supervision of Knoll, and even created an offshoot label named Andante, which didn't last long and was a variation of their classical releases on Varèse just under that brand. Scott W. Holton was also a producer during the label's early years until his death. Initially, the new label was located at 6404 Wilshire Boulevard in Los Angeles, later moving to 13006 Sataquai Street, North Hollywood, California, 91605, then 11846, Ventura Boulevard, Suite 130 Studio City, California, 91604, and finally to Beverly Hills, California once the label was acquired by Concord Music in 2018. The label would become one of the largest producers of soundtrack releases on LP during the late 1970s and through the 1980s up until the compact disc format would appear in 1983. The label would eventually produce a handful of soundtrack releases on CD during the format's early stages, as well as a dozen classical reissues from the LP counterparts. Starting from 1990 until now, the label would produce up to 50 new soundtrack releases per year and would create a vast library soundtrack releases, which was far more than any other record label would produce in a yearly period. In the early 1990s, the classical division was virtually eliminated for a new division devoted to Broadway shows as well as cabaret and show tune albums by popular and respected Broadway artists, which would also dominate the genre throughout the 1990s. In 2003, Varèse celebrated the label's 25th anniversary by releasing 2 4-CD compilation sets dedicated the releases produced by the label up to that point. Additionally, 2 more 4-CD sets were released in 2008 to celebrate its 30th anniversary and 2013 to celebrate its 35th anniversary. Finally, in 2018 the label produced a modest 2-CD set to celebrate its 40th anniversary milestone for the label, and would be the last for longtime producer and executive Robert Townsend, who had run the label from 1989 until early 2019, whose final release was fittingly Jerry Goldsmith's Raggedy Man reissue for the Varèse Club, 2. Presently, Varèse continues to release new music and reissues of its vast catalog of owned and licensed material. A commercial website dedicated to Varèse Sarabande releases can be found at varèsesarabande.com. The Varèse CD Club is their signature line dedicated to unreleased and/or expanded versions of classic soundtracks. All CD Club titles are limited edition and are usually available for purchase via the Varèse site as well as their current and older releases through them as well as other soundtrack retailers. Colosseum Schallplatten. This German record label, based in Nuremberg, was Varese Sarabin's European equivalent, which marketed most Varese Sarabin titles overseas, and had done so since the inception of the 47,000 CD series. The initial Varese CDs sold in Europe were either imported from Varese or pressed by Coliseum using JVC disc technology. Varese pressed CDs featured a solid black design, while the Coliseum pressings had the same designs printed in outline red. Thus, each label could print titles independently, and many Varese titles that went out of print in the US were sometimes available from Coliseum. After 1989, Coliseum made several CD pressings that were exclusive to Europe and, because of their connection to Varese, were given a VSD catalog number. Presently, Coliseum had expanded their output with their own series of releases apart from the Varese line, with CVS replacing VSD on specific European pressings of new Varese titles. Some VSD listings were occasionally visible on certain reissues and exclusive digital downloads. The label was also the exclusive distributor of Varese Club titles in Europe and occasionally had titles available long after they sold out in the United States. The label has ceased operations as of late 2015. Soundtrack Listeners Communications, SLCS. From 1990 through 1997, Varese Sarabin licensed their releases vintage and current to Soundtrack Listeners Communications, SLCS for short, in Japan through this label run by Yashiro Wada. The label specialized in releasing soundtracks that have never been on CD before, as well as reissuing out-of-print titles that were on CD as well LP that has been in demand by collectors. They had a special limited edition club called SLCS Club, which was somewhat similar to Varese's US Club that issued soundtracks from other labels such as RCA/Victor and many others as limited editions, but were not numbered like Varese's were at the time. Yet, only up to 1,000 copies were produced, which included John Williams's Space Camp, Henry Mancini's Return of the Pink Panther and Two for the Road, and Dave Grusin's 3 Days of the Condor. Many came with an OBI strip, a paper that wrapped around the side of the CD case containing information on the release in Japanese with the title and date of release, as well as the price in Japanese yen currency. These strips are very popular amongst soundtrack collectors and particular, their older releases. Most titles contained a fold-out booklet or a regular-sized booklet with liner notes in Japanese pertaining to the title and the composer. Their versions of Varese's releases utilize the US poster artwork as well much improved artwork in a lot of cases to distinguish themselves from their US counterparts. However, the music was identical to that of the original US releases and were never expanded in any way unless Varese themselves expanded the title. They also released soundtracks from Varese's LP catalog that were exclusive for the Japanese market, which included Joseph LaDuca's Evil Dead/Evil Dead 2, John Harrison's Creepshow, and David Mansfield's Year of the Dragon. They also produced a compilation set dedicated to Oscar winner Jerry Goldsmith called Jerry's Recall, amongst these special releases not available in the US. These releases were made available through imports in the US for double the price of a regular US priced disc, averaging from $30 to $40 per disc for a single disc release, and much more for multi-disc sets. Several herbicides were developed as part of efforts by the United States and the United Kingdom to create herbicidal weapons for use during World War II. These included 2,4-D, 2,4,5-T, EMS-PA2, methyl-4, chlorophenoxyacetic acid, 1414B and 1414A, recoded LN-8 and LN-32, and isopropyl phenylcarbamate, 1313. Recoded LN-33. In 1943, the United States Department of the Army contracted botanist and later bioethicist Arthur Galston, who discovered the defoliants later used in Agent Orange, and his employer University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign to study the effects of 2,4-D and 2,4,5-T on cereal grains, including rice and broadleaf crops. 28. While a graduate and postgraduate student at the University of Illinois, Galston's research and dissertation focused on finding a chemical means to make soybeans flour and fruit earlier. 29. He discovered both that 2,3,5 triodobenzoic acid (TIBA) would speed up the flowering of soybeans and that in higher concentrations it would defoliate the soybeans. 29. From these studies arose the concept of using aerial applications of herbicides to destroy enemy crops to disrupt their food supply. In early 1945, the U.S. Army ran tests of various 2,4-D and 2,4-5-T mixtures at the Bushnell Army Airfield in Florida. As a result, the U.S. began a full-scale production of 2,4-D and 2,4-5-T and would have used it against Japan in 1946 during Operation Downfall if the war had continued. In the years after the war, the U.S. tested 1,100 compounds, and field trials of the more promising ones were done at British stations in India and Australia in order to establish their effects in tropical conditions, as well as of the U.S. testing ground in Florida. 27. Between 1950 and 1952, trials were conducted in Tanganyika, at Kokori and Stanyansa, to test arboricides and defoliants under tropical conditions. The chemicals involved were 2,4-D, 2,4-5-T, and endothol, 3,6-endoxohexadrophilic acid. During 1952-53, the unit supervised the aerial spraying of 2,4-5-T in Kenya to assess the value of defoliants in the eradication of tsetse fly. 27. Early use. In Malaya, the local unit of Imperial Chemical Industries researched defoliants as weed killers for rubber plantations. Roadside ambushes by the Malayan National Liberation Army were a danger to the British Commonwealth forces during the Malayan emergency. Several trials were made to defoliate vegetation that might hide ambush sites, but hand removal was found cheaper. A detailed account of how the British experimented with the spraying of herbicides was written by two scientists, E.K. Woodford of Agricultural Research Council's Unit of Experimental Agronomy and H.G.H. Kearns of the University of Bristol. 32. After the Malayan emergency ended in 1960, the U.S. considered the British precedent in deciding that the use of defoliants was a legal tactic of warfare. Secretary of State Dean Rusk advised President John F. Kennedy that the British had established a precedent for warfare with herbicides in Malaya. Map showing locations of U.S. Army aerial herbicide spray missions in South Vietnam taking place from 1965 to 1971. In mid-1961, President Ngo Dinh Diem of South Vietnam asked the United States to help defoliate the lush jungle that was providing cover to his enemies. In August of that year, the Republic of Vietnam Air Force conducted herbicide operations with American help. Diem's request launched a policy debate in the White House and the State and Defense Departments. Many U.S. officials supported herbicide operations, pointing out that the British had already used herbicides and defoliants in Malaya during the 1950s. In November 1961, Kennedy authorized the start of Operation Ranch Hand, the codename for the United States Air Force's herbicide program in Vietnam. The herbicide operations were formally directed by the government of South Vietnam. 37. During the Vietnam War, between 1962 and 1971, the United States military sprayed nearly 20 million U.S. gal, 76 million L, 17 million imp gal, of various chemicals, the rainbow herbicides, and defoliants, in Vietnam, eastern Laos, and parts of Cambodia as part of Operation Ranch Hand, reaching its peak from 1967 to 1969. For comparison purposes, an Olympic-size pool holds approximately 660,000 U.S. gal, 2,500,000 L, 550,000 imp gal. 38, 39, 33. As the British did in Malaya, the goal of the U.S. was to defoliate rural/forested land, depriving guerrillas of food and concealment and clearing sensitive areas such as around base perimeters and possible ambush sites along roads and canals. 40. 37. Samuel P. Huntington argued that the program was also part of a policy of forced draft urbanization, which aimed to destroy the ability of peasants to support themselves in the countryside, forcing them to flee to the U.S.-dominated cities, depriving the guerrillas of their rural support base. 41. Duration, 1 minute and 47 seconds. 1 to 47. Military film footage of U.S. troops spraying Agent Orange from a riverboat in Vietnam in February 1969. Agent Orange was usually sprayed from helicopters or from low-flying C-123 provider aircraft, fitted with sprayers and MC-1 hourglass pump systems and 1,000 U.S. gal, 3,800 L, 830 imp gal, chemical tanks. Spray runs were also conducted from trucks, boats, and backpack sprayers, 42, 43, 44, altogether, over 80 million L, 18 million imp gal, 21 million U.S. gal, of Agent Orange were applied, 45. The first batch of herbicides was unloaded at Tan Son Nhut Air Base in South Vietnam on January 9, 1962, 46. U.S. Air Force records show that at least 6,542 spraying missions took place throughout Operation Ranch Hand, 47. By 1971, 12% of the total area of South Vietnam had been sprayed with defoliating chemicals, at an average concentration of 13 times the recommended U.S. Department of Agriculture application rate for domestic use, 48. In South Vietnam alone, an estimated 39,000 square miles, 100,000 square kilometers, of agricultural land was ultimately destroyed, 49. In some areas, TCDD concentrations in soil and water were hundreds of times greater than the levels considered safe by the EPA, 50. 51. The campaign destroyed 20,000 square kilometers, 7,700 square miles, of upland and mangrove forests and thousands of square kilometers of crops, 52 overall. More than 20% of South Vietnam's forests were sprayed at least once over the 9 years, 53, 54. 3.2% of South Vietnam's cultivated land was sprayed at least once between 1965 and 1971. 90% of herbicide use was directed at defoliation, 37. The U.S. military began targeting food crops in October 1962, primarily using Agent Blue. The American public was not made aware of the crop destruction programs until 1965, and it was then believed that crop spraying had begun that spring. In 1965, 42% of all herbicide spraying was dedicated to food crops. In 1965, members of the U.S. Congress were told crop destruction is understood to be the more important purpose, but the emphasis is usually given to the jungle defoliation in public mention of the program. The first official acknowledgement of the programs came from the State Department in March 1966, 53-55. When crops were destroyed, the Viet Cong would compensate for the loss of food by confiscating more food from local villages. 37. Some military personnel reported being told they were destroying crops used to feed guerrillas, only to later discover most of the destroyed food was actually produced to support the local civilian population. Wolverine wrote in 1977 that ecologist Arthur H. Westing, during a 1969 visit to Quang Ngai Province, had been told that 15 crop destruction missions had been approved in the province for 1970. According Verwee, these missions would have been enough to cover 85% of croplands in the province and would have caused famine and left hundreds of thousands of people without food or malnourished, although it was unclear if all the approved missions were actually carried out. 56. According to a report by the American Association for the Advancement of Science, the herbicide campaign had disrupted the food supply of more than 600,000 people by 1970. 57. Many experts at the time, including plant physiologist and bioethicist Arthur Galston, opposed herbicidal warfare because of concerns about the side effects to humans and the environment from indiscriminately spraying the chemical over a wide area. As early as 1966, resolutions were introduced to the United Nations charging that the U.S. was violating the 1925 Geneva Protocol, which regulated the use of chemical and biological weapons in international conflicts. The U.S. defeated most of the resolutions, 58-59, arguing that Agent Orange was not a chemical or a biological weapon as it was considered a herbicide and a defoliant, and it was used in effort to destroy plant crops and to deprive the enemy of concealment and not meant to target human beings. The U.S. delegation argued that a weapon, by definition, is any device used to injure, defeat or destroy living beings, structures, or systems, and Agent Orange did not qualify under that definition. It also argued that if the US were to be charged for using Agent Orange, then the United Kingdom and its Commonwealth nations should be charged since they also used it widely during the Malayan emergency in the 1950s. 60. In 1969, the United Kingdom commented on the draft Resolution 2603, ZIV. The evidence seems to us to be notably inadequate for the assertion that the use in war of chemical substances specifically toxic to plants is prohibited by international law. 61. The environmental destruction caused by this defoliation has been described by Swedish Prime Minister Olof Palme, lawyers, historians, and other academics as an ecocide. A study carried out by the Bionetic Research Laboratories between 1965 and 1968 found malformations in test animals caused by 2,4,5-T, a component of Agent Orange. The study was later brought to the attention of the White House in October 1969. Other studies reported similar results, and the Department of Defense began to reduce the herbicide operation. On April 15, 1970, it was announced that the use of Agent Orange was suspended. 2 brigades of the Americol Division in the summer of 1970 continued to use Agent Orange for crop destruction in violation of the suspension. An investigation led to disciplinary action against the brigade and division commanders because they had falsified reports to hide its use. Defoliation and crop destruction were completely stopped by June 30, 1971. 37. Gallery. Stacks of 200 L, 44 imp gal, 53 US gal, drums containing Agent Orange. Stacks of 200 L, 44 imp gal, 53 US gal, drums containing Agent Orange. Defoliant spray run, part of Operation Ranch Hand, during the Vietnam War by UC-123B Provider aircraft. Defoliant spray run, part of Operation Ranch Hand, during the Vietnam War by UC-123B Provider aircraft. U.S. Army Armored Personnel Carrier, APC, spraying Agent Orange over Vietnamese rice fields during the Vietnam War. U.S. Army Armored Personnel Carrier, APC, spraying Agent Orange over Vietnamese rice fields during the Vietnam War. A UH-1D helicopter from the 336th Aviation Company sprays a defoliation agent over farmland in the Mekong Delta. There are various types of cancer associated with Agent Orange, including chronic B-cell leukemia, Hodgkin's lymphoma, multiple myeloma, non-Hodgkin lymphoma, prostate cancer, respiratory cancer, lung cancer, and soft tissue sarcomas. 62. Some literature claims that neither Agent Orange nor its contaminants are carcinogenic in humans. 63. Vietnamese people. Main article: Impact of Agent Orange in Vietnam. The government of Vietnam states that 4 million of its citizens were exposed to Agent Orange, and as many as 3 million have suffered illnesses because of it. These figures include their children who were exposed. 9. The Red Cross of Vietnam estimates that up to 1 million people are disabled or have health problems due to Agent Orange contamination. 10. The United States government has challenged these figures as being unreliable. 11. According to a study by Dr. Nguyen Viet Nam, children in the areas where Agent Orange was used have been affected and have multiple health problems, including cleft palate, mental disabilities, hernias, and extra fingers and toes. 64. 65, 66. In the 1970s, high levels of dioxin were found in the breast milk of South Vietnamese women and in the blood of U.S. military personnel who had served in Vietnam. 67. The most affected zones are the mountainous area along Truong Son Long Mountains and the border between Vietnam and Cambodia. The affected residents are living in substandard conditions with many genetic diseases. 68-69. In 2006, Duc No and colleagues of the University of Texas Health Science Center published a meta-analysis that exposed a large amount of heterogeneity, different findings, between studies. A finding consistent with a lack of consensus on the issue. 70. Despite this, statistical analysis of the studies they examined resulted in data that the increase in birth defects/relative risk, RR, from exposure to Agent Orange/dioxin appears to be on the order of 3 in Vietnamese-funded studies, but 1.29 in the rest of the world. There is data near the threshold of statistical significance suggesting Agent Orange contributes to stillbirths, cleft palate, and neural tube defects, with spina bifida being the most statistically significant defect, 24. The large discrepancy in RR between Vietnamese studies and those in the rest of the world has been ascribed to bias in the Vietnamese studies, 70. 28 of the former U.S. military bases in Vietnam, where the herbicides were stored and loaded onto airplanes, may still have high levels of dioxins in the soil, posing a health threat to the surrounding communities. Extensive testing for dioxin contamination has been conducted at the former U.S. air bases in Da Nang, Phu Cat District, and Bien Hoa. Some of the soil and sediment on the bases have extremely high levels of dioxin, requiring remediation. The Da Nang Air Base has dioxin contamination up to 350 times higher than international recommendations for action, 71-72. The contaminated soil and sediment continue to affect the citizens of Vietnam, poisoning their food chain and causing illnesses, serious skin diseases, and a variety of cancers in the lungs, larynx, and prostate, 64. A person with birth deformities associated with prenatal exposure to Agent Orange. A person with birth deformities associated with prenatal exposure to Agent Orange. Major Tu Duc Phang was exposed to dioxin-contaminated Agent Orange. Major Tu Duc Phang was exposed to dioxin-contaminated Agent Orange. A group of handicapped children in Ho Chi Minh, some of them affected by Agent Orange. A group of handicapped children in Ho Chi Minh, some of them affected by Agent Orange. Can Lay, 55 years old, and her son, Covan Vac, 14 years old, Aloi Valley, Vietnam, December 2004. Can Lay, 55 years old, and her son, Covan Vac, 14 years old, Aloi Valley, Vietnam, December 2004. U.S. and Allied veterans. A United States disinformation propaganda poster in Vietnamese describing how safe Agent Orange is, intended to refute the communists' propaganda. However, scientists within the United States had been protesting the use of Agent Orange since 1966, on the basis that it was a chemical weapon used indiscriminately, even before its toxic effects to humans were established in print, 73. While in Vietnam, U.S. and Free World Military Assistance Forces soldiers were told not to worry about Agent Orange and were persuaded that the chemical was harmless, 74. After returning home, Vietnam veterans from all countries that served began to suspect their ill health or the instances of their wives having miscarriages or children born with birth defects might be related to Agent Orange and the other toxic herbicides to which they had been exposed in Vietnam. U.S. veterans. U.S. veterans began to file claims in 1977 to the Department of Veterans Affairs for disability payments for health care for conditions they believed were associated with exposure to Agent Orange, or more specifically, dioxin. But their claims were denied unless they could prove the condition began when they were in the service or within 1 year of their discharge, 75, in order to qualify for compensation. U.S. veterans must have served on or near the perimeters of military bases in Thailand. During the Vietnam era, where herbicides were tested and stored outside of Vietnam, veterans who were crew members on C-123 planes flown after the Vietnam War, or were associated with Department of Defense (DoD) projects to test, dispose of, or store herbicides in the U.S., 76. By April 1993, the Department of Veterans Affairs had compensated only 486 victims, although it had received disability claims from 39,419 soldiers who had been exposed to Agent Orange while serving in Vietnam, 77. In a November 2004 ZOGB international poll of 987 people, 79% of respondents thought the U.S. chemical companies that produced Agent Orange defoliant should compensate U.S. soldiers who were affected by the toxic chemical used during the war in Vietnam, and 51% said they supported compensation for Vietnamese Agent Orange victims, 78. Australian and New Zealand veterans. Several official investigations in Australia failed to prove otherwise, 79. Even though extant American investigations had already established that defoliants were sprayed at U.S. air bases, including Bien Hoa Air Base, where Australian and New Zealand forces first served before being given their own tactical area of responsibility, TOR. Even then, Australian and New Zealand non-military and military contributions saw personnel from both countries spread over Vietnam, such as the hospitals at Bang Son and Crenna, on secondments at various bases, and as flight crew and ground crew for flights into and out of Da Nang Air Base, all areas that were well documented as having been sprayed, 80, 81, 82. It wasn't until a group of Australian veterans produced official military records, maps, and mission data as proof that the TOR controlled by Australian and New Zealand forces in Vietnam had been sprayed with the chemicals in the presence of personnel that the Australian government was forced to change its stance. Only in 1994 did the Australian government finally admit that it was true that defoliants had been used in areas of Vietnam where Australian forces operated, and the effects of these may have been detrimental to some Vietnam veterans and their children. 8. It was only in 2015 that the official Australian War Memorial accepted rewriting the official history of Australia's involvement in the Vietnam War to acknowledge that Australian soldiers were exposed to defoliants used in Vietnam. 83. New Zealand was even slower to correct its error, with the government going as far as to deny the legitimacy of the Australian reports in a report called the McLeod Report, published by Veterans Affairs NZ in 2001. Thus infuriating New Zealand veterans and those associated with their cause. 84, 85. In 2006, progress was made in the form of a Memorandum of Understanding signed between the New Zealand government, representatives of New Zealand Vietnam veterans, and the Royal New Zealand Returned and Services Association, RSA, for monetary compensation for New Zealand Vietnam veterans who have conditions as evidence of association with exposure to Agent Orange, as determined by the United States National Academy of Sciences. In 2008, the New Zealand government finally admitted that New Zealanders had been exposed to Agent Orange while serving in Vietnam, and the experience was responsible for detrimental health conditions in veterans and their children. 86. Amendments to the memorandum made in 2021 meant that more veterans were eligible for an ex gratia payment of NZ$40,000. 87. National Academy of Medicine, Institute of Medicine. Starting in the early 1990s, the federal government directed the Institute of Medicine, IOM, renamed the National Academy of Medicine, to issue reports every 2 years on the health effects of Agent Orange and similar herbicides. First published in 1994 and titled Veterans and Agent Orange, the IOM reports assess the risk of both cancer and non-cancer health effects. Each health effect is categorized by evidence of association based on available research data. 43. The last update was published in 2016, entitled Veterans and Agent Orange, Update 2014. The report shows sufficient evidence of an association with soft tissue sarcoma, non-Hodgkin lymphoma, NHL, Hodgkin disease, chronic lymphocytic leukemia, CLL, including hairy cell leukemia and other chronic B-cell leukemias. 88. Limited or suggested evidence of an association was linked with respiratory cancers, lung, bronchus, trachea, larynx, prostate cancer, multiple myeloma, and bladder cancer. Numerous other cancers were determined to have inadequate or insufficient evidence of links to Agent Orange. 88. The National Academy of Medicine has repeatedly concluded that any evidence suggestive of an association between Agent Orange and prostate cancer is limited because chance, bias, and confounding could not be ruled out with confidence. 89. At the request of the Veterans Administration, the Institute of Medicine evaluated whether service in these C-123 aircraft could have plausibly exposed soldiers and been detrimental to their health. Their report post-Vietnam dioxin exposure in Agent Orange-contaminated C-123 aircraft confirmed it. 90. U.S. Public Health Service. Publications by the United States Public Health Service have shown that Vietnam veterans, overall, have increased rates of cancer and nerve, digestive, skin, and respiratory disorders. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention notes that in particular, there are higher rates of acute/chronic leukemia, Hodgkin's lymphoma and non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, throat cancer, prostate cancer, lung cancer, colon cancer, ischemic heart disease, soft tissue sarcoma, and liver cancer, 91-92, except liver cancer. These are the same conditions the U.S. Veterans Administration has determined may be associated with exposure to Agent Orange/dioxin and are on the list of conditions eligible for compensation and treatment, 92-93. Military personnel who were involved in storage, mixture, and transportation, including aircraft mechanics and actual use of the chemicals, were probably among those who received the heaviest exposures, 94. Military members who served on Okinawa also claim to have been exposed to the chemical, but there is no verifiable evidence to corroborate these claims, 95. Some studies have suggested that veterans exposed to Agent Orange may be more at risk of developing prostate cancer, 96, and potentially more than twice as likely to develop higher-grade, more lethal prostate cancers, 97. However, a critical analysis of these studies and 35 others consistently found that there was no significant increase in prostate cancer incidence or mortality in those exposed to Agent Orange or 2,3,7,8. tetrachlorodibenzo, P. dioxin, 98. U.S. veterans of Laos and Cambodia. During the Vietnam War, the United States fought the North Vietnamese and their allies in Laos and Cambodia, including heavy bombing campaigns. They also sprayed large quantities of Agent Orange in each of those countries. According to one estimate, the U.S. dropped 475,500 U.S. gal, 1,800,000 L, 395,900 imp gal, in Laos and 40,900 U.S. gal, 155,000 L, 34,100 imp gal, in Cambodia, 39, 99, 100, because Laos and Cambodia were both officially neutral during the Vietnam War. The U.S. attempted to keep secret its military operations in those countries from the American population and has largely avoided compensating American veterans and CIA personnel stationed in Cambodia and Laos who suffered permanent injuries as a result of exposure to Agent Orange there, 99-52. One noteworthy exception, according to the U.S. Department of Labor, is a claim filed with the CIA by an employee of a self-insured contractor to the CIA that was no longer in business. The CIA advised the Department of Labor that it had no objections to paying the claim, and Labor accepted the claim for payment. Civilian exposure to Agent Orange in Vietnam, GAO 05-371 April 2005. Figure 3. Overview of the workers' compensation claims process for contract employees. Of the 20 claims filed by contract employees of the United States government, 9 were initially denied by the insurance carriers and 1 was approved for payment. The claim that was approved by Labor for payment involved a self-insured contractor to the CIA that was no longer in business. Absent an employer or insurance carrier, the CIA acting in the role of the employer and the insurance carrier stated that it had no objections to paying the claim. Labor reviewed the claim and accepted it for payment. Ecological impact. See also, environmental impact of war. About 17.8% or 3,100,000 hectares, 31,000 square kilometers, 12,000 square miles of the total forested area of Vietnam was sprayed during the war, which disrupted the ecological equilibrium. The persistent nature of dioxins, erosion caused by loss of tree cover, and loss of seedling forest stock meant that reforestation was difficult or impossible. In many areas, 19, many defoliated forest areas were quickly invaded by aggressive pioneer species, such as bamboo and cogon grass, making forest regeneration difficult and unlikely. Animal species diversity was also impacted. In one study, a Harvard biologist found 24 species of birds and 5 species of mammals in a sprayed forest, while in 2 adjacent sections of unsprayed forest there were, respectively, 145 and 170 species of birds and 30 and 55 species of mammals. Dioxins from Agent Orange have persisted in the Vietnamese environment since the war. settling in the soil and sediment and entering the food chain through animals and fish that feed in the contaminated areas. The movement of dioxins through the food web has resulted in bioconcentration and biomagnification. 18. The areas most heavily contaminated with dioxins are former U.S. air bases. 103. Sociopolitical impact. American policy during the Vietnam War was to destroy crops, accepting the socio-political impact that would have. 57. The Rand Corporation's Memorandum 5446, ISA/ARPA states, the fact that the Viet Cong, obtain most of their food from the neutral rural population dictates the destruction of civilian crops. If they are to be hampered by the crop destruction program, it will be necessary to destroy large portions of the rural economy, probably 50% or more. 104. Crops were deliberately sprayed with Agent Orange and areas were bulldozed clear of vegetation, forcing many rural civilians to cities. Ice Ice Baby is the debut single by American rapper Vanilla Ice, 2, released by SBK Records on his debut album, To the Extreme, 1990. It is his best-known song and has appeared in remix form on Platinum Underground and Vanilla Ice is Back. A live version appears on the album Extremely Live, while a new metal version appears on the album Hard to Swallow, under the title Too Cold. Ice Ice Baby samples the bass line of the song Under Pressure by British rock band Queen and British singer David Bowie, who did not receive songwriting credit or royalties until after it had become a hit. Ice Ice Baby was first released as the B-side to Vanilla Ice's cover of Play That Funky Music, but the single was not initially successful. When disc jockey David Morales, 3, played Ice Ice Baby instead, it began to gain success. Ice Ice Baby was the first hip-hop single to top the US Billboard Hot 100. The song topped the charts in Australia, Belgium, the Netherlands, New Zealand, the Republic of Ireland, the UK and Germany. 4-5. Lyrics and music. Headshot of Vanilla Ice with a goatee wearing a black t-shirt and baseball cap. Vanilla Ice based the song's lyrics upon the South Florida area in which he lived. Robert Van Winkle, better known by his stage name Vanilla Ice, wrote Ice Ice Baby in 1983 at the age of 16, basing its lyrics upon his experiences in South Florida. 6. The lyrics describe a shooting and Van Winkle's rhyming skills. 7. The chorus of Ice Ice Baby originates from the signature chant of the National African American Fraternity Alpha Phi Alpha. 8. 9. Of the song's lyrics, Van Winkle stated in a 2001 interview that if he released Ice Ice Baby today, it would fit in today's lyrical respect among peers. You know what I'm saying? My lyrics aren't, pump it up, go, go. At least I'm saying something. 10. Further information, list of songs subject to plagiarism disputes. The song's hook samples the bass line of the 1981 song Under Pressure by Queen and David Bowie. 11. Who did not initially receive credit or royalties for the sample. 12. In a 1990 interview, Van Winkle claimed the two melodies were slightly different because he had added an additional note on the end of the fourth beat. 13. In later interviews, Van Winkle readily admitted he sampled the song and claimed his 1990 statement was a joke. Others, however, suggested he had been serious. 13-14. After representatives for Queen and Bowie threatened a copyright infringement suit against him, the matter was settled out of court, with Van Winkle being required to pay financial recompense to the original artists. 15. Bowie and all members of Queen were also given songwriting credit for the sample. 13. Ice Ice Baby is written in the key of D minor. 16. In December 1990, Van Winkle told British youth music magazine Smash Hits, where he came up with the idea of sampling Under Pressure, Frowny Face 17. The way I do stuff is to go through old records that my brother has. He used to listen to rock and roll and stuff like that. I listened to funk and hip-hop because rock wasn't really my era. But having a brother like that, well, I just mixed the two, and he had a copy of Under Pressure. And putting those sounds to hip-hop was great. Robert Van Winkle, Smash Hits. Ice Ice Baby is an early example of pop rap. 18, with Van Winkle describing himself as the first rapper to cross into the pop market. He said that although his pioneer status forced him to take the heat for a lot of people for his music's use of samples, the criticism he received over sample use allowed sampling to become acceptable in mainstream hip-hop. 19. Release. Ice Ice Baby was initially released by Ichiban Records as the B-side to Van Winkle's cover of Play That Funky Music. 12:20. The 12-inch single featured the radio, instrumental and a cappella versions of Play That Funky Music, and the radio version and Miami Drop remix of Ice Ice Baby. 21. When a disc jockey named David Morales, 3, played Ice Ice Baby instead of the single's A-side, the song gained more success than Play That Funky Music. 12. A music video for Ice Ice Baby was produced for $5,000. 22-23. The video was financed by Van Winkle's manager, Tommy Kwan, and shot on the roof of a warehouse in Dallas, Texas. 24. In the video, Van Winkle is shown rapping the lyrics while he and others dance to the song. Heavy airplay of the video by The Box while Van Winkle was still unknown increased public interest in the song. 25. Ice Ice Baby was given its own single, released in 1990 by SBK Records in the United States and EMI Records in the United Kingdom. The SBK single contained the Miami Drop, instrumental and radio mixes of Ice Ice Baby, and the album version of It's a Party. 26. The EMI single contained the club and radio mixes of the song, and the shortened radio edit. 27. The single was quickly pulled from the American market soon after the song reached number 1, in a successful attempt to drive consumers to buy the album instead. 28. Reception. Ice Ice Baby garnered critical acclaim, was the first hip-hop single to top the Billboard charts. 29. And has been credited for helping diversify hip-hop by introducing it to a mainstream audience. 30. Larry Flick from Billboard magazine commented, "Photogenic white rapper rocks impressively over a sparse beat bed that borrows heavily from Queen's Under Pressure. Could pack a powerful multi-format punch." 31. The Daily Vault's Christopher Thalen said it did more for overexposure than New Coke did for soft drinks. 32. Entertainment Weekly reviewer Mim Udovich wrote that Vanilla Ice probably would have scored with his hit rap single, Ice Ice Baby, even if he hadn't been white. There's just something about the way its hook, a sample from Queen and David Bowie's Under Pressure, grabs you and flings you out onto the dance floor. 33. Selena Webb from Music Week said, equally lacking in originality, yet holding the same commercial appeal. She added, the catchy part is borrowed from Queen's Under Pressure, the vocal is a cool white rap. Slightly more street cred than the new kids, yet falling squarely into the same huge market. 34. A reviewer from the Network 40 said that, like Mellow Man Ace, the rap melts slowly and is as much a mood piece as it is a cruising tune. A motocross champion from Dallas via Miami, the 22-year-old Ice, says it's time to chill out. 35. Stephen Dalton from NME complimented it as a catchy pop thumper. 36. Following the song's success, California rapper Mario "Chocolate" Johnson, an associate of record producer Suge Knight, claimed that he had helped in writing the song and had not received credit or royalties. 37. Knight and 2 bodyguards arrived at the Palm in West Hollywood, where Van Winkle was eating. After shoving Van Winkle's bodyguards aside, Knight and his own bodyguards sat down opposite Van Winkle, staring at him before finally asking, "How you doin'?" 37. Similar incidents were repeated several times before Knight showed up at Van Winkle's suite on the 15th floor of the Bel Age Hotel, accompanied by Johnson and a member of the Los Angeles Raiders. 37. According to Van Winkle, Knight took him out on the balcony by himself and implied that he would throw Van Winkle off unless he signed the rights to the song over to Knight. 38. Legacy. Detroit-based rapper Eminem states that when he first heard Ice Ice Baby, I felt like I didn't want to rap anymore. I was so mad because he was making it real hard for me. 39. After audiences began to view Van Winkle as a novelty act and a pop star rather than a legitimate rapper, his popularity began to decline. 40. Van Winkle lost some credibility among hip-hop fans, but later began to regain some success. attracting a new audience outside of the mainstream audience that had formerly accepted him and then rejected him. 40. Ice Ice Baby continues to be the signature song that Van Winkle is best known for internationally, although Van Winkle states that his American fans like his newer music better. 41. According to Rolling Stone, the Ice Ice Baby Under Pressure controversy is a landmark music copyright case, since it sparked discussion about the punitive actions taken in plagiarism cases. The magazine's Jordan Runtag added, though Vanilla Ice paid the price, some argue that isn't enough to make up for the potential credibility lost by Queen and David Bowie, who are now linked to him through a collaboration they had no choice in joining. 15. A live version of the song appeared on the album Extremely Live. 42. Ice Ice Baby was re-recorded in a new metal version titled Too Cold. 43. Originally intended to be released as a hidden track or B-side, Too Cold was featured on Van Winkle's 1998 album Hard to Swallow and received radio play in some markets. In 2000, a remix titled Ice Ice Baby 2001 was released in Europe as a single, with a newly produced music video. The remix generated new international interest in Van Winkle's music. 44. Ice Ice Baby was awarded one of BMI's Pop Awards in 1992, honoring the songwriters, composers, and music publishers of the song. 45. In November 2011, MTV Dance ranked the song number 71 in their list of the 100 biggest 90s dance anthems of all time. 46. In 2019, Billboard magazine listed it at number 108 in their ranking of Billboard's top songs of the 90s. 47. VH1 and Blender ranked Ice Ice Baby 5th on its list of the 50 most awesomely bad songs ever. 48. It was also given the distinction by the Houston Press as being the worst song ever to emanate from Texas. 49. In 1999, the song's music video was retired on the MTV special 25 Lane, in which Van Winkle himself appeared to destroy the video's master tape. Given a baseball bat, Van Winkle ended up destroying the show's set. 50-51. However, in December 2007, VH1 ranked the song in 29th place of their 100 greatest songs of the 90s. 52. In 1991, Alvin and the Chipmunks released a cover version entitled Ice Ice Alvin for their album The Chipmunks Rock the House. 53. Weird Al Yankovic included the chorus as the final song in Polka Your Eyes Out, the polka medley from his 1992 album Off the Deep End. 54. In 2004, the song was featured in the film 13 Going on 30. In 2010, the song was featured in the Glee episode Bad Reputation, as performed by Will Schuester, Matthew Morrison. 55. In 2012, several references to the song were made in the film That's My Boy, where Van Winkle appeared as himself. Protagonist Donnie Berger, Adam Sandler, an old friend of Van Winkle, asks him for money, claiming he should be loaded with the royalties he receives from the song. However, Van Winkle tells him that Queen took 50%, Suge took the other 60%. I fucking owe money when that shit gets played, man. Later on, Donnie and Van Winkle drive in Van Winkle's Ford Mustang 5.0, a reference to the car he drove in the music video, but not the same car. Then listen to the song on Van Winkle's Walkman as they run. Under Pressure is a song by the British rock band Queen and singer David Bowie. Released as a single in October 1981, it was later included on Queen's 10th studio album Hot Space, 1982. The song reached number 1 on the UK singles chart, becoming Queen's second number 1 hit in their home country and Bowie's third. It also charted in the top 10 in more than 10 other countries. The song has been described as a monster rock track that stood out on the Hot Space album. Under Pressure was listed at number 31 on VH1's 100 Greatest Songs of the 80s, and voted the second best collaboration of all time in a poll by Rolling Stone. In 2021, it was ranked number 429 on Rolling Stone's list of the 500 greatest songs of all time. It was played live at every Queen concert from 1981 until the end of the band's touring career in 1986. 5, 6, 7 live recordings appear on Queen live albums, including Queen Rock Montreal and Live at Wembley 86. The song was included on some editions of Queen's first greatest hits compilations, such as the original 1981 Electro release in North America. It appears on the band's compilation albums Greatest Hits 2, Classic Queen, and Absolute Greatest, and on Bowie compilations such as Best of Bowie 2002, The Platinum Collection 2005, The Best of David Bowie 1980/1987 2007, Nothing Has Changed 2014, Legacy 2016, and Call 3 2017. Under Pressure was sampled by American rapper Vanilla Ice for his 1990 single, Ice Ice Baby. Vanilla Ice initially did not credit Bowie or Queen, who sued and gained a songwriting credit on Ice's song. Under Pressure has been recorded by American rock bands My Chemical Romance and The Used, and singer Shawn Mendes, whose version featured singer Teddy Geiger. Shio Shio covered the song, with Swans frontman Michael Gira, for Shio Shio's 2008 album Women as Lovers. Background and composition. Under Pressure was recorded at Mountain Studios in Montreux, Switzerland, in September 1981. Queen, working on their 1982 album Hot Space, had been working on a song called Feel Like, but were not satisfied with the result. 9. Although it was said that the collaboration started from Queen running into David Bowie at Mountain while recording Cat People, Putting Out Fire, 10. The story told in interviews was that Bowie happened to be around in Montreux and lived nearby to the studio, so Queen invited Bowie down to the studio and it took off from there. 11. The track was recorded during one marathon evening session at Mountain, with vocals and mixing completed at the Power Station in New York a couple of weeks later. 12. Bowie sang backing vocals for Queen's song Cool Cat, 13, but his vocals were removed from the final song because he was not satisfied with his performance. Afterwards, they worked together for a while and wrote Under Pressure. 14, 15. It was credited as being co-written by the 5 musicians. The scat singing that dominates much of the song is evidence of the jam beginnings as improvisation. However, according to Queen bassist John Deacon, as quoted in a French magazine in 1984, 16, the song's primary musical songwriter was Freddie Mercury, though all contributed to the arrangement. As Brian May recalled to Mojo magazine in October 2008, it was hard, because you had 4 very precocious boys and David, who was precocious enough for all of us. David took over the song lyrically. Looking back, it's a great song, but it should have been mixed differently. Freddie and David had a fierce battle over that. It's a significant song because of David and its lyrical content. 17. The earlier, embryonic version of the song without Bowie, Feel Like, is widely available in bootleg form, and was written by Queen drummer Roger Taylor. 18. Also, some confusion has arisen about who had created the song's bassline. John Deacon said, in Japanese magazine Music Life in 1982, that David Bowie created it. In more recent interviews, Brian May and Roger Taylor credited the bass riff to Deacon. Bowie, on his website, said the bassline was already written before he became involved. 19. Roger Taylor, in an interview for the BBC documentary Queen, The Days of Our Lives, stated that Deacon did indeed create the bassline, and that all through the sessions in the studio, he had been playing the riff over and over again. He also claims that when the band returned from dinner, Deacon misremembered the riff, but Taylor was still able to remember it. 20. According to Brian May in a 2016 article for Mirror Online, it was actually Bowie, not Taylor, who had inadvertently changed the riff. The riff began as DC began playing, 6 notes the same, then 1 note a fourth down. After the dinner break, Bowie changed Deacon's memory of the riff to ding 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 diddle ing ding. 21. Resuction. Under Pressure has received critical acclaim since its release, with multiple publications ranking it among Queen and Bowie's best songs and among the greatest songs of all time. On release, Sandy Robertson of Sounds called Under Pressure the cornerstone of its parent album. 22. Record World said that Bowie and Freddie Mercury combine for a spellbinding musical experience. 23. Reviewing Hot Space decades later, Stephen Thomas Erlewine of AllMusic called Under Pressure as the album's undeniable saving grace, and the only reason most listeners remember this album. 24. He described the song as an utterly majestic, otherworldly duet that recaptures the effortless grace of Queen's mid-70s peak, but is underscored with a truly affecting melancholy heart that gives it a genuine human warmth unheard in much of their music. 24. Similarly, Ned Raggett of AllMusic described the song as anthemic, showy, and warm-hearted, and a clear standout for both acts. 25. Following Bowie's death in 2016, Jack Hamilton of Slate called Under Pressure a masterpiece, and is a reminder to the public that Bowie could be wonderfully, powerfully human. 26. The September 2005 edition of online music magazine Stylus singled out the bassline as the best in popular music history. 27. In November 2004, Stylus magazine music critic Anthony Mixio commented that Under Pressure is the best song of all time, and described it as Queen's opus. 28. In 2012, Slant magazine listed Under Pressure as the 21st best single of the 1980s. 29. It was listed at number 31 on VH1's 100 Greatest Songs of the 80s, 30, and voted the second best collaboration of all time in a poll by Rolling Stone magazine. 31. It is ranked number 429 on Rolling Stone's list of the 500 greatest songs of all time. 32. Music video. The music video for the song features neither Queen nor David Bowie due to touring commitments. 33. Taking the theme of pressure, director David Mallet edited together stock footage of traffic jams, commuter trains packed with passengers, explosions, riots, cars being crushed, and various pieces of footage from silent films of the 1920s, most notably Sergei Eisenstein's influential Soviet film Battleship Potemkin, The Eagle, My Lady of Winds, The Silent Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde starring John Barrymore and F.W. Murnau's Nosferatu, a masterpiece of the German Expressionist movement. 33. 34. The video explores the pressure cooker mentality of a culture willing to wage war against political machines, and at the same time love and have fun. There is also footage of crowds enjoying concerts, and many black and white kissing scenes. 34. Top of the Pops refused to show the video in its original form due to it containing footage of explosions in Northern Ireland, so an edited version was instead shown. 35. In 2003, Slant magazine ranked Under Pressure number 27 among the 100 greatest music videos of all time. In 1999, Scottish 11-year-old Sophie Patterson travels to a Turkish holiday resort with her 30-year-old father, Callum, who moved to London after separating amicably from her mother. Sophie records the holiday on a mini-DV camera, the footage of which is interspersed throughout the film. Over the course of the holiday, Sophie befriends and observes various teenage English tourists at the resort, often meeting and playing arcade games with a boy named Michael. Callum exhibits signs of depression, anxiety, and internal turmoil, which he tries to hide from Sophie beneath a facade of contentment. During his time alone, he practices Tai Chi and reads self-help books. He also smokes, which he hides from Sophie. One day, Sophie and Callum go scuba diving and she loses her expensive scuba mask. Callum feigns nonchalance, but Sophie senses his actual feelings, says she knows the mask was expensive, and comforts him. Callum later tells their diving instructor that he is surprised he has lived to be 30. Soon after, Callum and Sophie go to a rug shop, where she sees him grapple with the cost of one he likes. He declines to buy the rug, but later returns alone and buys it. The next night, Sophie and Callum attend a karaoke night and Sophie signs them up for a song. Callum refuses to sing with Sophie, despite her insistence, and she sings "Losing My Religion" alone as Callum watches. Upset by being left alone by him, Sophie refuses to return to their room with him and hangs out with some other tourists she previously met playing billiards. Michael creeps up on Sophie from behind, frightening her. They later kiss beside a pool. Meanwhile, Callum goes to the beach and walks into the ocean. When Sophie returns to their room, She finds him asleep naked and gently covers him with a sheet. The two reconcile the next day while traveling to the mud baths, and Callum apologizes for his behavior the previous night. Sophie surprises him by having other tourists sing, for he's a jolly good fellow for his 31st birthday. Callum watches stoically. He is shown sobbing in the hotel room alone. On the floor is a postcard addressed to Sophie that tells her to never forget that he loves her. On the last night of their holiday, Callum and Sophie dance to Under Pressure in a loving embrace. In the morning, at the airport, Callum waves goodbye and sends Sophie off on her flight home. In the present day, the adult Sophie lives in New York with her wife and young child. The rug that Callum bought, now worn with use, lies on their bedroom floor. Sophie watches the video footage from the holiday in Turkey. Interspersed throughout the film are abstract, dreamlike sequences in which the adult Sophie stands in the middle of a crowded rave, catching glimpses of Callum dancing frantically through strobing lights. Throughout the sequences, Sophie attempts to get closer to him, eventually briefly embracing him. With their hands wrapped around each other, Callum ultimately falls from Sophie's grasp. In the final scene, Callum packs the camcorder away and walks down the airport hallway after having waved goodbye to Sophie, opening the doors to the rave. The process of harmonization of mind, heart, selfhood and identity is achieved through personal transformation, which presents a challenge to the individual's accepted beliefs. In Hegel's writings, the challenge of personal growth often involves an agonizing alienation from one's natural consciousness that leads to a reunification and development of the self. Similarly, although social unity requires well-formed institutions, it also requires a diversity of individuals with the freedom, in the positive sense of the term, to develop a wide variety of talents and abilities, and this requires personal agency. However, rather than an end state, both individual and social unification is a process that is driven by unrelenting negations. In this sense, education involves the shaping of the human being with regard to their own humanity as well as their innate intellectual skills. So, the term refers to a process of becoming that can be related to a process of becoming within existentialism. The term Bildung also corresponds to the Humboldtian model of higher education from the work of Prussian philosopher and educational administrator Wilhelm von Humboldt, 1767 to 1835. Thus, in this context, the concept of education becomes a lifelong process of human development, rather than mere training in gaining certain external knowledge or skills. Such training in skills is known by the German words Erziehung and Ausbildung. Building, in contrast, is seen as a process wherein an individual's spiritual and cultural sensibilities as well as life, personal and social skills are in process of continual expansion and growth. Bildung is seen as a way to become more free due to higher self-reflection. Von Humboldt wrote with respect to Bildung in 1793/1794. Education, Bildung, truth and virtue must be disseminated to such an extent that the concept of mankind takes on a great and dignified form in each individual. G.S. I. page 284. Incomplete short citation, however. This shall be achieved personally by each individual, who must absorb the great mass of material offered to him by the world around him and by his inner existence, using all the possibilities of his receptiveness. He must then reshape that material with all the energies of his own activity and appropriate it to himself so as to create an interaction between his own personality and nature in a most general, active, and harmonious form. 1. Most explicitly in Hegel's writings, the Bildung tradition rejects the pre-Kantian metaphysics of being for a post-Kantian metaphysics of experience. Much of Hegel's writings were about the nature of education, both Bildung and Erziehung, reflecting his own role as a teacher and administrator in German secondary schools, and in his more general writings. 2. More recently, Gadamer and McDowell have used the concept in their writings.